I signed the contract under warm lights, surrounded by smiles and polite applause. It should have been a night that proved everything was worth it. Yet as congratulations washed over me, clarity hit hard. This wasn't just success. It was the moment I realized how little it mattered to those I'd carried for years. And that truth would demand the hardest choice of my life. For most of my life, I was the one everyone described as fine. I was fine when plans changed at the last minute. Fine when no one asked how my day went. Fine when expectations quietly landed on my shoulders without discussion. I learned early that being fine made things easier for everyone else. When something broke, I figured it out. When money was short, I adjusted. When tension filled the room, I softened my voice and smoothed it over. No one ever told me to do these things. That was the part that made it complicated. I just noticed that when I handled problems quietly, life moved on, and when I didn't, it stalled. So I adapted. I became the daughter who didn't need help, the one who didn't ask questions that made people uncomfortable, the one who could always manage. If you'd asked my family back then, they would have said I was independent, responsible, mature for my age. What they wouldn't have said is that I was tired. But tired didn't look dramatic. It didn't come with slammed doors or raised voices. It looked like staying late at work, then going home to check bank balances and calendars. It looked like answering messages with, "It's okay, I'll handle it," even when it wasn't. I didn't rebel. I didn't fight. I just stayed quiet and kept going. And over time, that quiet became part of how everyone saw me. There's a strange thing that happens when you're consistently capable. People stop seeing effort. They only see results. And once they trust that you'll always catch the falling pieces, they stop noticing how heavy those pieces are. I didn't realize it then, but my silence wasn't empty. It was observant. I was paying attention to patterns. Who spoke when decisions were made? Whose opinions carried weight? Who was allowed to fail? And who was expected to compensate? I noticed how quickly problems became mine without ever being called that. I noticed how praise traveled in one direction, while responsibility traveled in another. And I noticed something else too. Every time I stayed calm, people felt safer pushing a little more responsibility, a little more expectation, a little more reliance. They weren't doing it maliciously, not always. They were responding to the version of me I had presented so consistently the one who could handle it. That's the part no one warns you about. Silence can look like strength, but to the wrong people, it also looks like permission. There's a term for this that I learned much later: delayed agency. It's what happens when someone chooses not to act immediately, not because they're powerless, but because they're watching, because reacting too soon can cost you credibility, because showing emotion in the wrong system gets labeled as instability, because sometimes the safest move is to understand the rules before you challenge them. At the time, I didn't have language for any of that. I just knew that speaking up rarely changed outcomes. But observing did. I learned how money moved through our family. I learned how decisions were framed to sound mutual when they weren't. I learned how responsibility could be assigned without ever being acknowledged. And I learned where the pressure points were. None of that felt strategic in the moment. It felt like survival. There were nights I sat alone, scrolling through messages I hadn't answered yet, feeling a tightness in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not sadness. More like a constant readiness. like I was always on call. Even then, no one asked why I was so quiet. They mistook my silence for agreement, my patience for comfort, my consistency for endless capacity, and I let them, because speaking up would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to say yet, that I felt invisible, that I felt replaceable, that I was afraid if I stopped being useful, I would stop being needed altogether. So I kept going. I built a life that looked stable from the outside. Career progress, steady routines, a reputation for being dependable. The kind of life people point to and say, "She's doing great." What they didn't see was how carefully constructed that stability was. How much of it depended on me not asking for anything back. Silence, in that phase of my life, wasn't weakness. It was containment. I was holding everything in place, including myself, while trying to understand what would happen if I ever let go. I didn't know yet that this quiet period was temporary, that it was gathering information, that it was sharpening my sense of timing. I only knew that one day, something would force me to stop absorbing the weight. And when that day came, I needed to be clear, not emotional, not reactive, not confused, just clear. So I stayed silent a little longer. 3 years ago, I opened my banking app in the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in my car with the AC barely working, and I stared at 3 scheduled payments I had set up without even thinking. One to my parents' mortgage, one to a credit card in my mother's name, and one to my sister's program fees. They weren't small either. It was the kind of money that makes you pause before you tap confirm. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, sometimes more. The totals changed, but the pattern didn't. I didn't do it because anyone held a gun to my head. I did it because every time something went wrong, the problem somehow found its way to me. And after a while, I stopped waiting for them to ask nicely. I just started anticipating it. It began with the easy things: a utility bill that was late again, a car repair that couldn't wait, a short month where my dad said, "We'll pay you back next paycheck," and then the next paycheck came and nothing happened. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself, once things stabilize, once my sister finishes her program, once my parents catch up, it'll ease up. But it didn't ease up. It expanded. Money became the language we used instead of honesty. If they were worried, they didn't say, "I'm scared." They said, "Can you spot us this week?" If my mother was stressed, she didn't say, "I feel like I'm drowning." She said, "We need you to be responsible." And if I needed something, time, support, even just a simple, "Are you okay?" There wasn't really a language for that at all. There was just silence. Over time, I started noticing something that didn't make sense on paper. My father worked. My mother worked. They weren't unemployed. They weren't helpless. So where was their money going, and why was I always the safety net? At first, I didn't ask. I thought asking would make me selfish. I thought asking would make me the villain in my own family story. So I did what I always did. I adjusted. I stopped buying things for myself unless I could justify them. I started picking up extra work even when my schedule was already full. I learned how to say "it's fine" with a smile that didn't match how my stomach felt, and the more I gave, the more normal it became. That's the part that messes with your head, because people don't always exploit you with cruelty. Sometimes they exploit you with familiarity. They get used to you being the one who fixes it, and then they forget it ever needed fixing. My mother had a way of making the money feel like a test. If I helped, I was a good daughter. If I hesitated, I was keeping score. If I asked for transparency, I was making it about myself. And if I ever brought up the fact that I was helping while also building my own life, she would look at me like I'd said something ungrateful. Family helps family, she'd say. As if that phrase alone ended the conversation. My father was different. He didn't guilt me. He just minimized everything. It's not that much. Hannah, it's just for now. You know your sister needs this. My sister, Emily, rarely asked me directly. That's what made it even harder. She'd send a quick text. 2 lines. No details. Hey, Mom said the fee's due. Or, I'm short this month. I'm sorry. And I'd send the money. Because what was I supposed to do? Watch her fall apart in real time, because I finally decided to have boundaries. The thing no one tells you is that in families like this, the golden child doesn't always have to be cruel. Sometimes they just grow up inside a system that cushions them so well. They never learn what it costs someone else. And I was the someone else. I started to realize that in my family, money didn't represent support. It represented rank. The person who needed the money was the person who mattered. The person who provided the money was the person who was supposed to stay quiet. Because once you're the provider, you stop being a person with needs. You become a resource. And resources don't get celebrated. They get managed. That's why my successes never landed the way I thought they would. I could hit a milestone, get recognized at work, build something from scratch, and it would still be met with a nod, a half smile, a quick, "That's nice." Then, somehow, the conversation would drift back to Emily, how hard her program was, how exhausted she was, how proud they were. It wasn't even subtle. It was like watching someone change the channel the second my story came on. And at some point, I stopped expecting anything different. I just kept giving, thinking maybe generosity would earn me a seat at the table. But generosity doesn't earn love in a system that runs on entitlement. It just raises the price of your silence. I remember one specific night. It was late. I had just gotten home after a long day, kicked my shoes off by the door, and my phone buzzed. My mother, no greeting? No, how are you? Just we need $2, $400 by Friday. I stared at the message, and for the first time, I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity, not about the money, about the pattern, because that number wasn't a request. It was a command dressed up as necessity. And I realized something that made my chest go cold. They weren't calling me because they loved me. They were calling me because their system had trained them to believe I would always answer. That's when it hit me. The more I carried, the less they saw me. And it wasn't because I wasn't doing enough. It was because doing enough had become my role, and roles don't get thanked. Roles get demanded. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, you know what I mean. People praise you for being strong, but they punish you the moment you stop being convenient. They say you're independent, but what they really mean is you're available. They say you're mature, but what they really mean is you don't cause problems for them. I didn't have words for it back then. But I was living inside a quiet economy. I paid in silence. They paid in expectation. And everyone acted like that was love. I kept telling myself it was temporary, but deep down, I think I already knew the truth. This wasn't a rough season. This was the design. And the longer I played my part, the harder it became to imagine stepping out of it. Still, I didn't stop. Not yet. Because there was one thing I hadn't fully accepted. The moment I stopped paying, I wasn't just changing my budget. I was changing my place in the family, and I was about to learn what my place really was. That night at the resort, the desert air was still warm even after the sun dropped behind the hills. There were string lights stretched over the courtyard, soft music floating from hidden speakers, and the kind of polite laughter that always shows up when people are trying to look relaxed. My team had reserved a section by the water feature, this shallow, glowing pool that reflected everything like it was trying to make the night look even more perfect than it already was. I remember holding a glass I didn't really want, shaking hands with people whose names I had to repeat in my head so I wouldn't forget them 5 seconds later. Everyone kept saying the same thing. "Congratulations, Hannah. You earned this. We're lucky to have you." And I kept smiling, because that's what you do when the moment is finally yours. I had invited my parents and my sister because, honestly, because I wanted to believe I could. Because there was still a part of me that thought, if they see me like this standing in the light for once, something in them might soften. Something in them might finally say, "You did it. We're proud of you." They arrived late. My mother walked in like she was entering an event she was responsible for. Her posture was perfect. Her hair looked freshly styled, and she scanned the room like she was taking inventory. My father followed behind her, hands in his pockets, half smiling at people he didn't recognize. Emily came last, wearing a dress that made her look like she belonged in the center of the crowd, not the edge. She hugged my mother first, then my father. Then she gave me a quick squeeze like I was a cousin she hadn't seen in a while. Not cold, not cruel, just distant. I introduced them to a few people from my company. My mother's smile tightened when she heard titles. When she heard senior partner, when she heard lead on the project, she nodded like she understood. But she didn't ask a single question, not one. And then, when my director tapped his glass and started speaking, the whole courtyard quieted. He said my name, talked about the work I'd done, the deals I'd helped close, the nights I stayed late when everyone else went home. He called me one of the most steady people on the team. He said I had rare judgment. He said he'd seen me handle pressure in a way most people never learn. People clapped. A few people cheered. Someone at the back whistled. And right in the middle of that applause, I turned to look at my parents. My father was clapping politely, like he was watching someone else's child get recognized. My mother was smiling, but her eyes were already sliding toward Emily, like she was checking whether Emily was impressed. Emily leaned in and whispered something to her, and my mother's smile widened at Emily. Not at me. That was the first betrayal. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet confirmation that even in a moment built around my name, I still wasn't the center of their attention. After the speech, people came up in waves, co-workers, clients, friends, a steady stream of warm hands and kind words. My mother didn't say, "I'm proud of you." She said, "So this is what you do all day," like it was a strange hobby. Then she added, "Your father and I were just talking. Your sister's been under so much pressure." I blinked, waiting for her to circle back to me. She didn't. Instead, she launched into a story about Emily's workload, Emily's stress, Emily's future. My father nodded along, and Emily stood there, sipping her drink, letting it happen like it was normal. I felt something in my chest tighten, but I pushed it down. I told myself, not tonight. Don't ruin your own moment. I stepped away to greet another group. 10 minutes later, my mother found me again. This time, she wasn't smiling. She asked if we could talk somewhere quieter. There was a hallway near the event space that led to the conference room's clean carpet, muted lighting, the air colder than outside. She walked ahead of me like she already knew where the conversation was going. My father followed. Emily followed. The four of us stood there in that hallway, and suddenly the celebration felt like something happening in another world. My mother didn't ease into it. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't say anything about the speech. She pulled a folder from her bag and held it out like she was handing me a menu. "We need you to sign this," she said. I stared at the folder. "What is it?" "It's just paperwork," she said, already impatient. "A guarantee for a loan." My father cleared his throat. "It's to help us consolidate some things," Emily added softly. "It'll make everything easier." I flipped the folder open. It was a personal guarantee, my name, my address, my signature line, and a paragraph that made my stomach drop. I didn't say anything right away. I just read it again, slower. Because there are moments when your body reacts before your mind catches up. My palms started sweating. The hallway felt narrower. The words on the page looked too sharp, like they were cutting into the air. This wasn't just a loan. This was a promise that if anything went wrong, I would be responsible not just for what they owed now, but for what could be owed later. Future debt, additional balances, legal fees. My mother watched my face carefully, like she was waiting for the moment I would stop thinking and start obeying. "I'm not signing this," I said, quietly. And that's when the second betrayal happened. Because I wasn't met with surprise, I was met with anger. Immediate. Personal. My mother's voice rose just enough to turn heads if we'd been closer to the crowd. "Don't do this here," she hissed. "Not after everything we've done for you." I actually laughed once, under my breath, because the sentence was so upside down it didn't feel real. Everything they'd done for me. My father stepped in, the way he always did, soft voice, firm expectation. "Hannah," he said, like I was being difficult on purpose. "This is family. We need you to be reasonable." Emily's eyes widened, and she looked between us like she was watching something she didn't want to be involved in. "Just sign it," she said, quietly. "It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. I held the paper up slightly. "Do you understand what this says?" Emily shrugged. "Mom explained it." My mother snapped. "You always have to complicate things." And right then, standing in that cold hallway, I realized the celebration wasn't the reason they came. The applause wasn't the reason they sat through the speech. The title, the contract, the recognition, none of it mattered. They came because they thought my success made me more useful. That was the moment the illusion broke. Not because they needed help, because they needed control, and they assumed they still had it. I looked down at the page again, just to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. This signature could ruin me. Not emotionally, not metaphorically. Literally, it could touch my credit, my career, my ability to rent, to buy, to pass background checks. It could follow me for years. And the part that made it even colder was how normal they were acting, like this was a simple favor, like I was selfish for hesitating, like my entire life was something they could leverage. I closed the folder slowly. "I'm not doing this," I said again. My mother's face tightened. "So you're just going to abandon us?" My father sighed like I was breaking his heart. Emily looked away, and then my mother said the line that finally made everything inside me go quiet. "Don't forget where you came from," she said. "You wouldn't have anything without us." I stared at her, and I thought about the grocery store parking lot, the scheduled payments, the late-night transfers, the constant readiness, and it hit me, clear as glass. They hadn't come to celebrate who I was. They came to collect what they thought I owed. I could hear the music from the courtyard again, faint through the hallway walls, people laughing, someone calling my name. A moment that belonged to me still happening while my family tried to turn it into another transaction. I took a breath, and for the first time all night, I stopped trying to make them understand, because the truth was, they understood perfectly. They just didn't like that I finally did too. I handed the folder back to my mother, and in that small motion, I felt the beginning of something I had avoided my entire life. Not rage, not revenge, just a boundary. And the moment I said it, I saw the cost in their faces, which told me everything I needed to know about what I had been to them and what I was about to stop being. I didn't go back to the courtyard right away. I walked out of that hallway like my legs belonged to someone else, and I found an empty bench near the edge of the property where the lights didn't reach as far. The resort was beautiful in a way that almost felt cruel, perfect landscaping, clean stone pathways, warm pools of light, and beyond all of it, the dark outline of the desert stretching out like it had no end. My hands were still shaking, so I wrapped them around my phone, not because I wanted to scroll, but because I needed something solid to hold. Inside, the celebration kept going without me. I could hear the music, I could hear laughter, I could hear people calling my name, probably wondering where I'd disappeared to, and I sat there thinking, I just said no. That's all. I just said no. But in my family, no was never a neutral word. It wasn't a boundary. It was a betrayal. That was always the rule, even when no one admitted it out loud. 10 minutes later, my mother's voicemail came through. She didn't sound panicked. She sounded offended. "Call me back," she said. "Right now?" Then another. "This is not how you treat family, Hannah. Not after everything." Then my father texted, "We can talk. You don't have to make it dramatic." And then Emily, "Please don't do this. Not tonight." It was almost impressive how quickly the story flipped. A few minutes earlier, I was the reason we were all there, the person they'd come to see, the one being congratulated. And the moment I wouldn't sign, I became the problem. Have you ever experienced that feeling where you set one simple boundary and suddenly you're being treated like you set the whole house on fire? I stared at my screen and something in me went quiet, not numb, just settled. Like I had crossed a line and there was no pretending anymore. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to prove my point. I didn't want to defend myself in circles until I was exhausted and they were satisfied. I just wanted to say what I had never said, in the clearest way possible. But I knew if I tried to say it out loud, they would interrupt, they would reframe it, they would make it about tone, timing, gratitude. So I opened my notes app, and I started writing something I never planned to send. "Mom, Dad, I don't know when you stopped seeing me as your daughter and started seeing me as a solution. Maybe it happened slowly. Maybe it happened the first time I paid a bill and you felt relief instead of discomfort. Maybe it happened the first time you realized I would take care of things without asking questions. I don't think you're monsters. I don't even think you wake up and plan to hurt me. I think you got used to a version of me that didn't require anything from you, and you liked that version better. I kept writing. I'm not leaving because I hate you. I'm leaving because I've loved you in a way that cost me my own peace. I've been present in every emergency, every late fee, every we just need a little help, every this can't wait. But I haven't been present in your eyes when I've needed you, when I needed a proud look, when I needed someone to ask, "Are you okay?" When I needed to feel like I was more than what I could provide. I paused because I could feel my throat tightening, even though no one was there. That's the strange part about suppressed emotions. They don't show up when it's convenient. They show up when you finally stop holding your breath. I continued. You taught me that being strong meant not making anyone uncomfortable. You taught me that love meant being useful. You taught me that the safest way to belong was to not need anything. So I did what you rewarded. I stayed quiet. I stayed capable. I stayed available. And every time I did, you reached for more. Not because you're evil, because systems don't stop on their own. Systems keep running until someone shuts them off. I stared at those words for a long time. Systems. That was what our family had become. A system where one person carried weight, and everyone else acted like it was normal. Then I wrote the part that felt like a confession. I used to believe that if I just kept giving, you would eventually see me. That one day you'd look at me and realize what I had been doing all along. But tonight made something painfully clear. You don't see giving as love. You see giving as my role. And when I don't perform my role, you don't ask why. You get angry because the role was never supposed to change. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head as I typed. Family helps family. Don't keep score. Stop being so sensitive. But none of those sentences answered the real question. Why did you come to my night of celebration and try to turn it into paperwork? Why did you look at my success and only see what you could collect from it? Why did you hear applause for me and still speak to me like I was inconvenient? I wrote the next line slowly, like I was afraid of it. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. Because if I keep doing this, if I keep saying yes to avoid your disappointment, I'm going to lose more than money. I'm going to lose my ability to respect myself. And I can't afford that. Then I added something I didn't even realize I needed to say. You might call this abandonment. But abandonment is when you leave someone who has nowhere else to go. This is me leaving a room where my value has always been conditional. This is me leaving a place where love is measured in transactions. This is me refusing to be a resource instead of a person. I stopped for a moment and looked back at the first words, Mom, Dad. They looked so small on the screen. I wanted to soften it. I wanted to make it kinder. I wanted to add something that would make them less angry. But the truth isn't always kind. Sometimes it's simply true. I kept typing anyway. If you ever wonder why I didn't explain this to your faces, it's because I've tried. In smaller ways, for years, in the pauses you ignored, in the exhaustion you didn't ask about, in the moments I needed support and you offered expectations instead. And every time, I learned the same lesson: honesty only mattered if it made you comfortable. Tonight, I finally chose to matter to myself. I saved the note. I didn't send it. I didn't forward it to anyone. I just sat there with it, letting it exist, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to convince them. I was trying to tell the truth. Then my phone buzzed again, another voicemail, another text. The pressure started climbing, like it always did. But something had shifted. I wasn't scrambling for the right words anymore. I already had them. And as I stood up from that bench and started walking back toward the lights, I realized the hardest part wasn't saying no. The hardest part was accepting what their reaction to no revealed. And I wasn't done learning from it yet. That night, after I saved that note in my phone, I kept thinking about one question I didn't want to face. What if I had stayed, not for another week, not for another awkward conversation? What if I had stayed for another 5 years? Because that's what I had always done. I stayed through discomfort. I stayed through guilt. I stayed through the quiet feeling of being taken for granted, telling myself it wasn't that bad, telling myself family is complicated, telling myself I could handle it. So I tried to picture the version of my life where I went back into the courtyard, fixed my face, apologized for making it tense, and signed whatever they put in front of me. In that version, I think the night would have ended the way they wanted. My mother would have smoothed things over with a smile and a story. My father would have patted my shoulder like I'd done the right thing. Emily would have exhaled, relieved, because the pressure wasn't on her anymore. And I would have gone home with a title on my email signature and a legal obligation quietly attached to my name. Then the next morning, I would have woken up to the same familiar texts. Not "how are you?" Not "last night was amazing," but something like, "Can you call me? We need to talk about the next payment." Because when you give someone access to your life without boundaries, they don't see it as a gift. They see it as continuity. 5 years from that night, I can almost see the routine. Every month, I would have checked my accounts the way some people check the weather, bracing myself, calculating what I could afford to lose without it showing on my face. I would have kept a separate mental budget just for family emergencies. Not because emergencies kept happening, but because in families like mine, emergency is just the word people use when they don't want to plan, and I would have started to feel it in small places first. In the way I hesitated before buying something for myself. In the way I flinched when my phone rang late at night. In the way I stopped telling friends the truth, because it was easier to say, "Oh, it's just family stuff. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a movie trailer. Just the slow erosion of choice, because that's what constant obligation does. It doesn't explode your life, it narrows it. And it narrows it so gradually that one day you look up and realize you don't remember what it feels like to make a decision that isn't filtered through someone else's needs. In that 5-year version of my life, I think my career would have still moved forward. I'm not pretending I would have failed. I'm capable. I would have kept performing. I would have kept delivering. But I would have been doing it with a weight strapped to my back that no one at work could see. And the heavier that weight got, the less room I would have had for everything else. Dating? Maybe. Or if I did date, I would have chosen someone who also didn't ask much of me, because asking would have felt like pressure, and my system was already overloaded. Friendships would have become lighter, more surface level, because deep connection requires presence, and presence is hard when you're always on call for someone else. Even rest would have started to feel unsafe, because when you're the responsible one, rest comes with guilt, and guilt makes you reachable. Then there's the worst part, the part I didn't want to admit. In that 5-year version, the more I gave, the less they would have respected me. Not because I didn't deserve respect, because in a system built on entitlement, sacrifice becomes invisible. People stop seeing what you lose. They only see what they gain. So my family would have kept calling me strong. They would have kept telling other people how independent I am. They would have kept using my stability as evidence that they don't need to worry about me. And if I ever tried to pull back later, if I ever said, I can't do this anymore, the reaction wouldn't be understanding. It would be shock, anger, accusations. Because by then, the story would already be written. Hannah is the one who handles it. And once someone benefits from the story, they don't want it rewritten. I also think something else would have happened. I would have started resenting Emily, even if I didn't want to, because that's what systems like this do. They don't just drain you financially, they fracture relationships, they turn siblings into roles. One is protected, one is pressured, one is the dream, one is the engine. And engines don't get thanked. Engines are expected to run. 5 years later, maybe Emily would have finally finished her program. Maybe she would have gotten a job. Maybe she would have become exactly what my parents wanted her to be. And then what? Then there would have been a new reason, a new transition, a new cost, a new problem. Because when a family learns that you will fund their peace, they will always find a way to need more peace. And I would have stayed trapped in the same cycle, waiting for the day it became enough. That day doesn't come on its own. It has to be chosen. The scariest part of imagining that 5-year future is how ordinary it looks. No screaming matches every day, no dramatic betrayals on every holiday. Just a life where I slowly lost the ability to say no, because I trained everyone, including myself, to believe I didn't have that right. And then, one day, maybe I would have had my own crisis. Not a financial one, a personal one. The kind where you realize you're successful on paper, but you don't feel like you belong anywhere because the place that was supposed to be home only ever valued you for what you could provide. That's when people usually break. Not when they lose everything, when they finally understand they've been giving everything away. So when I picture that version of my life, I don't feel proud that I would have survived it. I feel grief that I ever thought survival was the goal. Because living isn't just paying bills and keeping things afloat. Living is having boundaries that protect your future. And that night, for the first time, I started to understand that staying wasn't kindness. Staying was surrender. And I wasn't willing to surrender myself for another 5 years. A few days after that night, I kept replaying one detail over and over. Not the folder, not the hallway, not even the words my mother said. It was the speed at which the mood changed the moment I stopped cooperating. 1 minute, they were family. The next minute, I was a threat. And that's when I started to understand something I wish someone had explained to me years earlier. People who look like they have all the power often don't. They have control, and control is not the same thing as power. Control is loud, it's emotional, it's immediate, it's do this right now. And how could you, and after everything we've done? Control works best in small closed systems like families, where roles have been assigned for so long that nobody remembers how they started. In my family, my mother had control because she controlled the story. She decided what was reasonable. She decided what was selfish. She decided what counted as love. And my father supported that control by staying calm and acting like her expectations were just common sense. That kind of control feels absolute when you're inside it. Because when you're raised in it, you don't just fear consequences. You fear disapproval. You fear being labeled the bad one. You fear losing your place. And once you fear losing your place, you'll do almost anything to keep it. That's why I stayed quiet for so long. But here's the part that changes everything. Control depends on cooperation. It can't survive without it. The moment I stopped cooperating, the control started to wobble, and that wobble showed up as anger. If you've ever dealt with someone who needs to control everything, you've probably seen this. They don't panic when things are fine. They panic when you become unpredictable, because unpredictability means they can't script you anymore. It means they can't rely on the version of you they've been managing. So they escalate, they guilt you, they threaten, they perform sadness, they rewrite history, not because they're trying to be dramatic, because they're trying to restore the system, and the system is the only place their authority makes sense. Outside that system, their authority is fragile. That's the difference between a family system and the real world. In my house growing up, my mother could say, "You're ungrateful," and it was treated like a verdict. In the real world, labels don't count as evidence. In the real world, you don't win by being louder. You win by being accurate, by being prepared, by understanding how things actually work. That was the first time I realized my mother's power had a boundary. It didn't reach into my bank's policies. It didn't reach into my employer's contracts. It didn't reach into legal language on a guarantee. It only reached as far as my willingness to feel guilty. And once I saw that, something shifted. Because if someone's influence is built on your emotions, then the moment you stop offering those emotions, their influence shrinks. Not overnight, not without backlash, but it shrinks. That's why people who seem powerful in private often fall apart when things get public, or formal, or documented. Because their power isn't based on skill, it's based on access. Access to your time, your attention, your fear. They've never had to build strength the hard way because the system gave it to them. It's like someone who's always had a key to every door. They start believing they're strong, but what they really have is a key. Take away the key, and suddenly they don't know how to open anything. That's what I saw in my father, too. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't shouting, but his calm was a strategy. It was meant to make me feel irrational, to make me second-guess myself, to make me think, maybe I'm overreacting, because in our family, calmness was treated like authority, and emotion was treated like weakness. But the truth is, the calmest person isn't always the strongest person. Sometimes they're just the person who benefits from you staying confused. When I refused to sign, my father didn't say, "Are you scared? Are you worried?" He said, "Don't make this dramatic." Translation: please stay in your role, because if I stepped out of it, he would have to face something he never wanted to face, how much of his comfort had been funded by my compliance. And then there was Emily, the golden child. Emily didn't need to control me directly because the system already did it for her. She didn't have to demand. She just had to exist as the reason my parents were stressed, the reason they needed help, the reason my boundaries were treated as betrayal. That's the thing about being protected in a system like that. You don't learn how to stand up. You learn how to be held up. So when the person holding you up finally steps away, it feels like the ground is disappearing, and everyone panics. Not because they miss you as a person, because they miss what you were providing. That realization was hard to swallow, but it was also clarifying, because it meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the pattern. I wasn't too sensitive. I was watching a system react to the loss of its most reliable support. Have you ever noticed how certain people only call you when they need something? How they're calm when you're giving, but chaotic when you hesitate? That's not love. That's dependency with a script. And scripts hate interruptions. What happened that night wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a power shift. My family's control had always worked because it stayed personal, emotional, and unspoken. But the moment they put paperwork in front of me, something written, something concrete, they accidentally moved the conflict into a world where feelings don't override facts. They moved it into a space where I could say, "This clause makes me liable," and no amount of guilt could change the wording. They tried to use my success as leverage, but what they didn't realize was that my success came with something else: competence, clarity, a sense of structure. And once you have structure, you stop being easy to manipulate. That's why the people who seem to have the most power often crumble when the rules change, because their power only existed inside the system they controlled. The moment you step outside it, they're just people. People with habits, people with expectations, people who don't know what to do when their usual moves stop working. And once I saw that, I understood something that frightened me and freed me at the same time. They weren't invincible. They were just used to me being predictable, and I was done being predictable. 3 weeks after that night, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a mug of coffee I kept forgetting to drink. The house was quiet in the way it only gets when you live alone. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. My phone was face down beside me. I had started doing that without thinking, because if I saw my mother's name light up the screen, my body would react before my mind could. I didn't want to live like that anymore, so I made a decision that felt small, but wasn't. I went into my banking app, found every recurring payment connected to my family, and turned them off, one by one. Mortgage contribution, credit card assistance, temporary transfers that had somehow lasted for years. I didn't do it with a speech. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn them. I just stopped. That was the first real move I made that wasn't about arguing or proving or being understood. It was about stepping out, because at some point, I realized something that changed the way I saw everything. This was never a fight I could win inside their rules. In their rules, I was wrong the moment I said no. In their rules, the person who holds the most guilt holds the most power. In their rules, love is measured by how much you sacrifice. So if I kept playing, even if I played perfectly, I would still lose. Not because I wasn't smart enough, because the game was built to drain me. Have you ever been in something like that, where you're constantly explaining yourself, constantly defending your choices, constantly trying to make the other person see your side, and somehow, every conversation ends with you feeling smaller? That's not communication. That's a rigged table. And the most misunderstood part is this: walking away isn't revenge. It's refusal. It's saying, I'm not participating in something that requires me to shrink in order for you to feel stable. The first week after I stopped the payments, the backlash came fast. My mother called 5 times in one day. When I didn't answer, she left messages that bounced between outrage and heartbreak. What are you doing? Are you trying to punish us? You're really going to do this to your own family. Then my father texted me, shorter messages, like he was trying to sound calm enough to make me feel irrational. Let's talk. You're taking this too far. This isn't like you." And Emily sent one message that I stared at for a long time. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family." That line used to crack me open because it sounds so simple, so moral, so final. But after everything that happened, it landed differently because I realized they only used family as a word when they wanted something from me, when I needed something space, respect, recognition. It was never family. It was, "You'll be fine." So I didn't respond right away, not because I was trying to punish them, because I was trying to hear my own thoughts again. 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the bank connected to the loan they had wanted me to guarantee, a routine notice, nothing dramatic. But seeing my parents' names printed next to financial terms made my stomach twist, not because I was responsible, because I remembered how close they had come to making me responsible. That's the part people don't talk about when they say, "It's just money." Money ties you to consequences. Money ties you to systems. And once your name is on paper, guilt doesn't protect you from legal reality. So I took a different kind of step. I met with an advisor through my company, someone who worked with employees on financial risk and personal liability. I brought the folder I had refused to sign. I brought screenshots of the old transfers. I brought the emails and texts. Not to build a case against them, to build a boundary for myself. And for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Not the relief of winning, the relief of being clear. At work, nothing changed about how I was treated. In fact, the opposite happened. My team kept moving forward. My projects kept coming. My name kept being associated with results. When I spoke in meetings, people listened. When I set limits, they were respected. When I said, "I can't do that by Friday," no one accused me of betrayal. No one called me selfish. They adjusted. They planned. They moved. It was such a simple contrast that it almost hurt, because it proved something I had always suspected, but never allowed myself to believe. The problem was never that I asked too much. The problem was that I asked the wrong system to treat me fairly. Family is supposed to be the place where you're valued for who you are. But in my family, I was valued for what I could absorb. And once I stopped absorbing, I stopped being good in their eyes. That's when I understood what my real victory was. It wasn't making them apologize. It wasn't proving I was right. It wasn't getting the last word. It was reclaiming the part of my life that didn't have to be negotiated. My mornings, my finances, my peace, my right to exist without being useful. People sometimes imagine boundaries as dramatic scenes. Someone slams a door. Someone says a powerful line. Someone walks away in slow motion. But real boundaries usually look boring. A missed call you don't return, a payment you don't send, a conversation you don't get pulled into, a decision you make quietly and stick to, even when it makes you look like the villain to people who benefited from your old role. I didn't win against my family. I stepped out of the game they built. And once I stepped out, I realized how much energy I had been spending just trying to survive inside it. Without that constant drain, my life didn't become perfect, but it became mine. And that was the first time success actually felt like success. Not because it impressed anyone, because it no longer came with a price tag attached to my identity. That night at the resort was supposed to be a celebration. In a way, it was. Just not the kind I expected. It wasn't the night I earned a title. It was the night I started earning myself back. If you're listening to this and part of you feels tight in your chest, I want to slow down for a second, because I know what it's like to hear a story like mine and think, okay, but what if it's my fault? What if I'm being dramatic? What if I'm ungrateful? What if I'm the one who's breaking the family? I thought all of that. And the truth is, those questions don't come from clarity. They come from conditioning. So here's what I want to ask you gently, but honestly. Are you quiet because you're at peace? Or are you quiet because you've learned that speaking up comes with consequences? Are you staying because you truly want to? Or are you staying because you're afraid of what they'll say about you if you leave? Because there's a difference. One is love. The other is fear wearing a familiar face. Maybe you're not dealing with money. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's emotional labor. Maybe you're the one who always answers the late-night calls, always fixes the misunderstandings, always swallows your own feelings so everyone else can be comfortable. And maybe nobody ever asked why you became that person. If that's you, I want you to notice something. In a healthy relationship, family or not, your boundaries don't destroy the connection. They protect it. The only time a boundary ruins everything is when the relationship was built on you having none. So if you've been thinking about setting one, here's a question that helped me. What happens if you don't fix it? Not as a threat, as an experiment? What happens if you don't send the money just once? What happens if you don't answer immediately? What happens if you say, I can't, and you let the discomfort exist without rushing to erase it? You learn very quickly what the relationship is actually made of. And I know that sounds scary, because it is. When you've been the steady one, the reliable one, the responsible one, stepping back feels like betrayal, but it isn't. It's information. It shows you whether you were being loved or being relied on. And if you're thinking, but they need me, I understand that too. Just remember, need is not the same thing as entitlement. Someone can need support and still respect you. Someone can need help and still treat you like a person. If they only treat you well when you give them what they want, that isn't love. That's a transaction. And if you're inside a transaction, you're allowed to stop paying. You don't have to do it dramatically. You don't have to announce it on a holiday. You don't have to turn it into a war. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly choose a different pattern, a different rule, a different life. Maybe your next step isn't cutting anyone off. Maybe it's just telling the truth to yourself. Maybe it's writing your own unsent letter, like I did. Not to send, not to punish, just to finally hear your own voice without interruption. Because once you can name what's happening, you stop being confused. And once you stop being confused, you become harder to control. So if you're listening and you're in that place where you're tired, but you can't explain why, please know this. You're not weak for staying as long as you have. You're not selfish for wanting peace. You're not wrong for questioning a system that only works when you suffer quietly. And you don't have to wait 5 more years to become allowed to choose yourself. If my story resonates, I'd love to hear yours. Share in the comments only what feels safe for you. And if you know someone who's been carrying too much in silence, send this to them. Sometimes one story is enough to make someone feel less alone. And if you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us because you deserve stories that remind you who you are, not just what you can provide.